Welcome to Smithville Chamber Chatter, coming to you from historic Smithville, Texas. We're here to talk about all things Smithville, including upcoming events, updates and tips for and about local businesses, important news, election updates, and more. Brought to you by the Smithville Area Chamber of Commerce, I'm your host, April Daniels. Welcome to our podcast. Good afternoon, and welcome to the Smithville Chamber Chatter podcast with your host, April Daniels. We're excited to be continuing our podcast series today, sponsored by the Smithville Area Chamber of Commerce and today's sponsor, Farmers Insurance, Scott Saunders agent. Our guest today is Bruce Blalock, railroad historian. Good afternoon, Bruce, and thank you for being our guest on the Smithville Chamber Chatter podcast.
It is my pleasure. Thank you, April.
Thank you, Bruce. And I cannot say how excited I am to have you as a guest on today's episode. I've heard you speak on several occasions about railroad history in Smithville. Can you talk to our listeners and our viewers about how and when the railroad came to our town and how that history has progressed over the years?
I certainly can, and thank you again for the opportunity. First of all, the railroads made small-town America. At the time of Smithville's development, the railroads were the most advanced business, transportation mode, and the greatest technology that existed. Just to set things up, Dr. Thomas Gasley was the first settler here, and he built the first store. It was located at what is now 909 Hudgens, and there was only wagon roads and trails in the area. The year after the Civil War, John Fawcett owned and operated a store, but sold it in 1867 to Dr. Taylor, the first doctor to arrive here, who later took Murray Burleson into a partnership. 3 years later, Dr. Taylor sold his interest to William Smith, which became Smithville, and that left Burleson and Smith handling the local trade. The home at 903 Short is where this store stood, and the building is now behind the house at 803 Colorado. Sass and Rosenfeld operated a store at what is now 401 Colorado. The original village was about where Burleson intersects with Colorado Drive over to Short Street. My personal opinion is that the beginning of modern Smithville began when Murray Burleson met Joseph Albert Hooper, probably as a result of a surveying party in the Smithville area. I have no way to document the meeting, but the results speak for themselves. Hooper was construction superintendent of the Taylor, Bastrop, and Houston Railroad. Burleson bought 2 parcels of land that are now the heart of Smithville and had the town surveyed and platted. Mr. Hooper became a partner in Burleson Smithville Townsite Company. On July the 4th, 1887, the very first train arrived and a small depot was opened. On July 27th of the same year, Smithville Townsite Company made its first sale. This is significant as the town was now platted using the railroad right-of-way as the boundary tangent. The 1890 census lists 616 people in Smithville and 1,634 in Bastrop. On April 10, 1893, the railroad was completed into Houston and was owned by the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas. On November 30th, 1893, the Katy announced that division headquarters will move to Smithville. Everything was about to change dramatically. The Smithville Times opened in 1894 following that business. On September the 5th, 1894, division headquarters of the Katy opened here and crew bases were established in Smithville. What this means: Smithville had the managers of the district, which controlled the railroad from Waco to Houston to San Antonio. The dispatchers were here, the foreman of the track and the bridge gangs, the car shops, the locomotive shops, which meant carpenters, pipe fitters, electricians, mechanics, machinists, train and engine crews. For every job created here, probably 3 people came with it, and maybe more. The terminals had been in Taylor and LaGrange, and all those jobs came to Smithville. Every train had a crew of 5, so a large crew base was created. The Katy built a YMCA to house people who were transferring to Smithville and did not have permanent housing. The terminal building itself was on the west end of the yard between the tracks going to Bastrop and to Lockhart. It was a large 2-story affair with the management in the top floor and passenger and express on the ground floor. It included a kitchen and dining room, as trains didn't have dining cars at the time. Passenger trains settled into a 2 each way per day routine, and locals could make good connections to northern or southern destinations. 3 hotels were built close to the depot: the Shadbolt, right across the track on First Street, the Lowry and the Somerville, both on Second Street. April 27, 1895, the city of Smithville was incorporated with the south boundary, quote, to the center line of the Missouri, Kansas, and Texas Railway right-of-way. So truly, the city is platted around the railroad. On September 15, 1896, the Crash at Crush occurred with an all-Smithville crew. This was a promotional crew put on by the Katy to attract attention to the area. It was conducted just south of Waco, of West Texas, north of Waco, and brought about 40,000 people into the area. As a matter of fact, Crush, Texas, as it was named, had the highest population in Texas for one day, 40,000 people. In 1900, the census lists Smithville with 2,577 souls and Bastrop with 2,145. Smithville would be the largest county until 1960. It's amazing what a crew base will do when it brings jobs. On December 26, 1905, the big depot burned. In 1906, the year after, the replacement depot opened at First and Main. The people of Smithville had asked the railroad to bring the depot over closer to the business district, which they certainly did, and the wishes were accommodated. By then, passenger trains usually consisted of a baggage car, railway post office, 2 coaches, a dining car, and a Pullman sleeper. That's a lot of cars with a lot of people that moved from Houston and Galveston through Smithville to Waco and points north. On February 8, 1911, a boiler explodes in the shop area, killing 10 workers. It was a huge tragedy, and it was felt by almost every family in town. Think about what that would be today. If we lost 10 people in one event today, it would be horrible for the city. I can well imagine what it was back to then. 1917, March the 23rd, the Chicago White Sox, which, by the way, all professional baseball teams travel by rail, were the 1917 World Series winner, played the Katy Athletic Club team in Smithville. No surprise, they won by a score of 9-1, and 850 Smithville people watched the game. 1 year later, on April the 5th, the Chicago White Sox played again here in town and won by the same score, 9-1, and the proceeds went to the Red Cross. In 1919, those White Sox players were accused of losing the World Series intentionally, and they became known as the Black Sox, even though they were acquitted. But those players played baseball in Smithville against the Katy's athletic team. July the 1st, 1922, the National Shopmen's Strike started. This brought serious labor unrest to Smithville and other Katy facilities as well. The strike was not honored by the operating crafts like the engineers and the trainmen, but without maintenance, it was hard to have reliable operations. Keeping those trains running and the track maintained and things like that were very difficult without the shopmen. It was settled about a year and a half later, and things returned to normal. In April 1929, the new Smithville Roundhouse was completed, and all around the shops in Smithville and the depot, there were flowers and hedging outlining the walkways. It was truly a beautiful place, well maintained by the railroad. The Great Depression affected railroad business as well as all others. Passenger service was severely cut back, no dining cars anymore, no Pullman, and a lot fewer trains. And then World War II came along. It brought a serious resurgence in business, and the Katy was hard pressed to have the equipment to move freight and personnel because they had furloughed a lot of people and they had literally scrapped a lot of their engines and cars. On November 21st, 1942, a locomotive boiler explosion killed the engine crew just south of Waco, Texas. The irony is the fireman on that locomotive was the son of one of the casualties of the locomotive boiler explosion of 1911. Joe Walker, one of our local favorites, was severely injured in that explosion, and he lived to retire from the railroad and live a great life in Smithville. After the war, World War II that is, Katie's physical plant was exhausted. Heavy maintenance was needed. At the same time, the railroad started buying diesel locomotives to improve efficiency and reduce crew requirements. This started the decline of the maintenance and repair forces in Smithville for cars and engines. And then on November the 11th, 1957, the last passenger train departed Smithville. It was a bad day for the local people. Post office mail was affected, and of course, people couldn't get on the train and travel anymore. Then the 1960 census shows Smithville smaller than Bastrop for the first time since 1900. Then in November of 1967, the Katy Depot burned. It was occupied by Duralux company that made carpet padding. Chemicals started the fire and made the fire hard to fight. It's really a loss because we could certainly use that building today. In 1975, Reginald Whitman was hired as chairman of the Katy to groom it either for sale or to be merged. Then in 1988, on August the 12th, Union Pacific bought the Katy Railroad. Everything started to change again. It worked very smoothly. The crew base remained the same. The maintenance forces remained the same, but it was a different company. Then on June the 1st, 1999, Smithville became an outlying terminal of the Union Pacific San Antonio Service Unit. It is now a crew change terminal that houses about 50 train and engine crew members. About the same number are employed in track and bridge maintenance. My purpose is not to say that Smithville would not be as it is without the railroad, but it's to recognize the fact that the Katy brought the presence of a public company with the interest, ability, and wherewithal to create business and employment environment of a greater portion than many small communities ever experienced. Without question, the railroad was the largest employer for more than 60 years. The Katy didn't create Smithville. It breathed economic life and promise into a small village at a level unimagined until that point. The fingerprints of that life are visible today and will continue far into the future. The railroad came, the streets came, the shops came, the people came, and the business came. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Bruce. That was fascinating. And I would like to point out, too, to our listeners and our viewers, I don't think we really realize how important the railroad is to the history of Smithville. We certainly see lots of imagery and artwork, and we certainly see the tracks down at the end of Main Street, but it really is great to understand the economic impact that the railroad had on this small community. Hearing those benchmarks over the years and how everything changed for our business community, for our community as a whole, affecting our post office and everything in between. I really appreciate you, Bruce, for taking the opportunity, taking the time to explain that in such a concise and clear manner. Thank you, Bruce.
You're quite welcome. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, sir. I also want to point out that Bruce Blalock has been very helpful in helping us as we continue to plan to rebuild not just the Chamber of Commerce building, but a large portion of that building is also dedicated just to railroad history. And we so appreciate Bruce and his advice and collaboration as we build out that new railroad museum. Thank you for that, Bruce.
It is my pleasure.
Yes, sir. Now, I do want to take one last opportunity to thank today's podcast sponsor, Farmers Insurance, Scott Saunders, agent. Thank you, Scott Saunders, for always being such a great supporter of the Chamber of Commerce and all of our programs. Thank you again, Bruce, for appearing with us today for this episode of the Smithville Chamber Chatter podcast. Be sure to subscribe for our listeners and viewers to our YouTube, iTunes, and Spotify channels, and follow us on Facebook. And until next time, be sure to enjoy Smithville, a big small town experience. Thank you for listening to Smithville Chamber Chatter with your host, April Daniels. If you'd like to be a guest, email us at april.daniels@smithvilletx.org. Between now and our next episode, be sure to check out the Chamber's website at www.smithvilletx.org. Until then, we'll see you on Main Street.